As you all know, today's speaker is Barbara Diefendorf, who's well known to all of you from reading her books on starting with the Paris City Councilors, which I've had reason to go back to lately because I've been looking at town council records all over the place. Then Beneath the Cross, looking at Protestants and Catholics in Paris. Then has shifted in more recent years to piety and religion, particularly in the early 17th century. And that's more or less going to be your focus today, a new project.
Actually, I want to talk about how I got doing religion. Finding religion in the archives, my title really is what I want to talk about, because I am really, well, I should start even before the religion part, I am an accidental early modernist. I went to graduate school expecting to work on 19th century Paris. Started at Berkeley because that was my nearby university. I was able to live inexpensively in those days there, work a couple of days a week and go to graduate school. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know any women who had PhDs at the time, and it would even have applied for a master's program, except one of my undergraduate teachers told me, don't apply just for the master's, they won't take you seriously. By which he meant they won't give you any money, but they didn't have much money to give away at that point anyway. Anyway, then they turned the person who gave me that advice down for tenure, and then the next year their French Revolutionary historian down for tenure. And the person I wrote my first seminar paper with, Dick Kerr, who was by that time doing Spanish history and not French history, said, well, you can work with me, but we're hiring a new person who's interested in the same kind of questions you're in, but a little earlier. And that person turned out to be Natalie Davis. And I won't say that it was all written right there the first day I walked into her class, but I guess by the end of the semester, the first day she asked what we were interested in, and I said, well, urban history, particularly Paris. And then she talked to the few other people, and she put things together with that and what she was doing, and she announced that we were going to work on the family in the cities of 16th century France. So I wrote my paper on marriage in 16th century Paris, and at the end of that she suggested I expand that into a dissertation, and I didn't want to do just marriage, so I expanded it into what became Paris City Councilors, because my models at that time were purely social history, mostly English history, crisis of the aristocracy, and things where people were looking at social mobility over generations, and I wanted to do that for France. The city councilors were just where I could find a group of people for a given length of time, a prosopography essentially that I could track their families. It's kind of ironic that the things we were doing with prosopography went out entirely once we had the computers that made it simple to calculate what happens over different generations. I had charts laid out all over the floor about what the sons did and all, trying to trace those things, and it would have been much easier to do 20 years later, but I wasn't interested, and neither was anyone else really at that moment. But that's how I came to be doing what became, again, the Paris City Councilors. At the time, I wasn't interested in religion. Again, by moving backwards from the later period, I had very little background, vague knowledge of the Reformation, but I somehow thought I could work on the Paris City Councilors without taking religion much into account. And of course, by the time I looked at the family trajectories and I realized the people who weren't moving upward into the rope nobility over time were the ones who had Protestants in the family, who were either leaving Paris entirely, or their careers were short-stopped, or they were even killed. A couple of them, of their relatives were killed on St. Bartholomew's Day. So obviously, the question that came out of that was then, why be a Protestant in this strongly Catholic city? There seemed to be, again, looking at the elites, no advantage to choosing the Protestant religion. Ultimately, I had to look at the fact that they chose it because they believed something. They were persuaded by a truth that Catholicism didn't give them. And those are the questions then that informed, or that led me to the book that became Beneath the Cross. I wanted to look at religion, but, and the reason, the kind of the paradox in my title is that religion is not easy to find in the archives. That is to say, you can find accusations. If you look at criminal cases, you find accusations, although those of you who've been reading French history know that ultimately the accusations not only aren't necessarily valid, but what they're looking for, by the time that they stop trying, the lay courts try sedition and not actually religious belief. So what they're really looking for, even if you can find a wonderful interrogation in the Parliament of Paris records, which I certainly found, but they ask who was there, where did you meet, sometimes what happened, but they don't ask what you believe. They don't ask what you think about all of this. So it proved an important source, and I was very lucky that somebody suggested that I meet Al Solman, whose work some of you may know. Al, his best work really is on witchcraft trials, and also he has some interesting work on sodomy and other kind of pulling odd cases out of the parliamentary procedures. What Al was useful for me was really helping me to learn how to read the handwriting of the minutes of Parliament, and particularly the ones that are taken at the time. It's never, there are always a lot of guessing going on there, but you begin to learn the formulas, and those of you who've done your archival work know you start from what you can read and work out from there. But that was only one part of the project. I needed still to, I guess I should say then, the other thing that Al did for me, besides helping me to learn to read that, was to point me in a direction I hadn't known about, which is the arrest records, which were kept separately in the police records. They go back, and that gave me the list of the people who were arrested for Protestantism that I could then cross-reference, first with their arrests and trials, but also I found there were 2 Protestant notaries in Paris, and then I could cross-reference them, and I still have volumes. I pulled them out recently because a young French friend is working through some of going beyond where I did on some of the real, the activists that were responsible for most of the arrests. And he's finding their later careers. These guys stayed active, some of them through the League. Some of them they're old men by then, but they are leading some of the most radical Catholics. And I'm curious to see what they're going to find. But in any case, to go back to my point, was that by finding the Protestant notaries, I was able again to trace a Protestant population and to find where they lived and their family ties. And I would add also here then, I was able to make use, the fact that I knew the Paris City Councilors was a big help in all of this too, that I had a kind of a baseline of people of familiarity with it that I wouldn't have had if I just plunged into a different city. But arrest records, again, didn't tell me what the Protestants believed. And for that was a stretch. I had to start reading everything else I could, treatises, poetry, Marot's Psalms. And actually, if you look at the headings on Marot's Psalms, a lot of them are quite warlike. He calls out and that was an interesting discovery for me. So I tried to find then in the chapters, if those of you who've read the book, the underground church is essentially a Protestant population, but then the shadow of God's wings is my attempt to then really understand what people believed, what was essential to them as their Protestant beliefs. Then I needed to look more at the Catholic side, and what I found there, when I started reading their sermons as parallels to the Protestant ones, was the really radicality of that, and discovering that actually I could place some of the sermons topically and time-wise, that they weren't just abstract when they were calling upon the king and essentially crediting the king with the power to annihilate the heretics, those that didn't believe. So the chapter, The Bellows of Satan, followed then. So essentially what I'm saying then is that to try to understand, to try to get to religion in the archives there, it wasn't one source. it was a whole process of moving through, trying to understand different ways that people believed. There was another chapter that was going to be the end of the book, which actually was published separately, that I followed some of the Protestants to Geneva and found family quarrels as people were fighting over property that was forbidden in France, and yet the Genevans couldn't disinherit a Catholic relative. A Catholic could no longer disinherit a Protestant relative because of the Protestant laws, although I'm sure they found ways to do it. But it didn't want, by the time the book came together, the book had a narrative logic, and I decided that it was better to end with the wars and to stop with that and to try to tie it back to the families. So that book came out. I was really surprised. I've been pleased that it's still in print after all of these years, and went back and looked at it, being asked to talk about my work over this period. I hadn't looked at the book for I don't know how many years, and it was interesting. But it was interesting also to me. I mean, what I remember also coming out of the book was that it led. Just as the first book had led into the second, and this isn't true of everybody, but for me, the second book led into the third, because the thing I was still really interested in was the Catholic radicals that were that last chapter, The Bellows of Satan. So I went back to the archives and I started looking at the Minims, as they've been some of the most active preachers, the Capuchins, and the Feuillants. And there were good documents, especially on the Capuchins and the Feuillants, mostly in the Bibliothèque Nationale, more than the archives. So I wanted to do a project then on the Catholic radicals. I got sidetracked when I got into women, because I found that this was at the point when still the historiography on women was pretty much women, and especially Catholic women, was that those nasty priests were confining them into convents, and what the women wanted to do was to be out there converting people, and they wanted a kind of social activism, but it was the men that were keeping them back. And that wasn't what I was finding, and that led me, when I started working on women, to continue to decide that there was a whole book there, that I needed to drop the men, at least for the time being, and look at the women's careers. And a key here, I would say, to get back to the archives, was that I had seen some footnotes in a 20th century biography of Beik, who brought the Carmelites to France, footnotes to the proceedings for her beatification, which were and still are in the Carmelite convent in Pontoise, outside of Paris. So I wrote to them and I had never worked in Catholic things. I was not raised in the faith, but I knew people who had worked. Said, oh, you're working in Catholic convents, it's really hard, you may not get in. What you need is essentially a reference, a personal reference, more than credentials, archival credentials. And so I got in touch with a local Carmelite convent in Concord, New Hampshire, where, by good fortune, one of the younger nuns, and they have the problem that many convents do, was from Quebec, and she got in touch. She wrote in French to the French archivist, or actually to the prioress at Pontoise, about my interest in working on these particular documents. And they invited me to come out to Pontoise so that the prioress essentially could apologize to me and explain to me that the archivist was senile, and they didn't exactly know where the archives were at the moment. They were kind of a mess, and I said, I'm a historian, this is a long-term project, I'll be back next year. And basically they took that year and got a new archivist. And I went back and worked out there for a couple of weeks in the convent, which was a really interesting experience to me, because the convent there is still in its original 17th century building. Actually, not the very first one, but the one that they moved into within 10 years or so. They lost the convent, of course, at the time of the Revolution, but many of the nuns there were from the local area. And so essentially there was enough sympathy in the locale that the nuns went home, they took their art with them, which is, I'll get to eventually, because I'm not done with the Carmelites. They took their art and they took their sisters that were from other places and they went and stayed home, and when all was over, they got the convent back. And the same thing happened in the early 20th century when France secularized again. So these nuns were living in the buildings and living as if it were the 17th century, except that they had telephones and copying machines. So a nun would come, I never met anyone except the priors and the archivist. They put me in the room where the visiting priest would be, and the archivist would bring me things, and I could hear her flip-flop of sandals as she would walk down the hall, and then a big key turning in an old door. And one time she did tell me, she said, you know, it's not, this is our enclosure. We don't think you're bursting in, but this is symbolic of our enclosure. So, of course, obviously I respected it, but what was funny was then that she would also go and make photocopies for me. And so somehow this juxtaposition of the 17th and the 20th century, I guess it still was then, was interesting. But what I found in the beatification records was also fascinating, because they had testimony from all three daughters. So I was able to read about her as a mother, a wife, an activist, because the testimony from people like Michel de Marillac, who was very close to her, about how she was out there when they were building the convent. She was out on the work site every day, supervising the workers, that she was in charge of the money and things. And all of this was so counter then to what I had been reading about the role of women. And then when I started following it up, I realized also, because the nuns that were the first nuns there, and there were several biographies of them, and even if some of the hagiography you figure, okay, you know, this is written to show how saintly this person is, but they didn't make up the fact that this nun was moved from 7 to 7 different convents during her life, in which case she had to deal with people to raise the money, to organize things, and all of that part of the story then, it seemed to me, had never been told. So I didn't want to just write a book about the Carmelites, and that led me then to looking at, you know, the other religious orders that I could find in the archives, the National Archives. Fortunately, things are spotty, but the convents that were in the territories, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the whole, the Latin Quarter now essentially, or at least the 6th and 7th arrondissements, and a lot of convents were founded there. They had some trouble. They were supervised by the monks of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and so I was able to read their records of visitations and inquests into some troubled convents. So again, archival sources leading to part of it, but also having to be blended with the hagiographies and the other forms of sources to get what became From Penitence to Charity. The name itself is kind of a coincidence. I was invited very early on to give a paper at DePaul University, which my little light bulb went on. Vincent, I had DePaul, you know, it's a sports university. I guess I never heard of it. I never thought beyond that. But because I was talking about Barbac-Carré, that was the part of the work I'd done at that point, and I knew I needed to end up with Louise de Marillac, so the title of that talk was From Penitence to Charity. And only as I was putting together, after a long time, my other research, and looking for a kind of a narrative structure for it, did I realize that that actually was the arc of my book, that it went from the extreme penitential piety that was there in Paris in the wake of the religious wars to the more outward-looking Catholicism of the mid-17th century. So, and that book then led into the one that's coming out next February. There is one more. I wasn't sure that there would be, but the men that I abandoned did not disappear entirely from my mind. After you publish a book, you get invited to do a lot of more talks and this and that, but you have to go back to your work and find something else. And the men came back to me at that point, but I didn't want to write a book that was ad men. I didn't want just to go back to the same subject. By fortunate coincidence, I had a sabbatical coming up, and I learned that they had changed the dates. At Boston University, you have to apply for outside funding before they'll grant you a sabbatical. You don't have to get the funding, you just have to prove that you've got a real project that you're undertaking. And they changed the deadline, and I had to do something on the spur of the moment. And so I thought, well, how about the Cassis, the Camargo Foundation in Cassis, which Jim was mentioning. Any of you who were here early on, we were raving about this beautiful place in the south of France. I thought, and again, this was kind of the spur of the moment, all right, the Catholic Reformation seems to come into France from Spain and Italy, as well as being developed at home in Paris. So if I go to the south of France, I can look at the developments there. I can go to the archives in Aix-en-Provence and in Marseille. And so that's what I wrote for the application, and I got the money and got to spend the semester there with the Mistral blowing, so that I had more time for the archives and less time to sit in the sun and enjoy life. And there, that was the first time I'd worked in the archives of departmental archives. But what I found in the H series is that those are the things that were collected at the time of the Revolution, what was left from various religious communities. And it was hit and miss. I found that things like my Carmelites they were too late. I still was really interested in the beginnings of Catholic reform. And the Carmelites don't come until the end of the 1630s. But I did find some really interesting material, particularly on a group I didn't know at all, the Trinitaires, which are they're called Mathurins in Paris, and if you've worked in Paris or in the Latin Quarter, you probably walked past their old church, but they were an order that was founded at the time of the Crusades, and they're a little bit out of it by the time of the Catholic Reformation, because most people are more interested in fighting Protestants than they are ransoming slaves, although it still was important, obviously, and those of you that are working in the Mediterranean know that. So it was, for me, what I found, though, that was interesting was that the Trinitaires, especially the Trinitaire of Arles, I had all their chapter records, the capitular records at the local level, the province, and their meetings with the whole order. And so what it was able to document was a reform from the bottom up. Basically what's happening in Arles and Marseille and the couple of other smaller monasteries is that they're seeing, in my interpretation, they're seeing the competition from the Capuchins, the Recollects, and the new orders. And they're trying to reform themselves on the model of a Catholic Reformation order. But they don't have the education. They are trying to figure out how to raise standards for their novices, how to educate them better than they're educated themselves, how to increase, how to get their priests to hear confessions better, essentially what questions they should be answering. They're in the chapter records. There are all kinds of things about how to be a good Catholic priest. And what I also found then is that there is a literature suggesting that this was a failed reform that starts in Paris. It's actually Joe Bergen, whom I respect a lot as a historian and who has agreed. He said, I wish I'd known your sources when I did this. But he was working from the Paris, the attempts to reform of the Cardinal de la Rochefoucauld, and finding that the Trinitarians were not, in fact, very well reformed, that the so-called reformed orders were not giving, as they were supposed to, a third of their income for the ransoming of slaves, that they were not saving a third or using a third to host pilgrims and to take care of the poor. And they were criticized then as not being reformed. And what I found, actually, again, by looking at more detailed at the local records, is they couldn't because they had no money. They weren't collecting any money. People had stopped giving to them, and the wars of religion had destroyed some of their monasteries, and they basically were stealing from the the cash box that was essentially the only money that was coming in for the ransoming of slaves. So I wrote a chapter, actually, an article that was published in a French journal on that. That was one of these things that I just did after the book, but I kept finding other things. There was another, I don't want to take the time to go into each of these, what is coming out in the book that will be published, and whose cover you will recognize from the publicity for this, because what I sent Chris was the cover for the book that is called Planting the Cross, Catholic Reform and Renewal in 16th and 17th century France, and it will come out from Oxford in February. I've just been working on the index, which I was hoping to send off before I came here, but I discovered that in one final set of revisions, I seem to have knocked the fourth off of Henry IV and blended him in with Henry III. And so I have to go back at the last minute and separate out each one of those references so that I don't get them pointing to the wrong king. So I've got a little more work to do, but then that will be done. But in any case, what it is a set of 6 case studies, all of which deal with the questions of what is reform, what is Catholic reform. They are all Catholic religious orders. I was going to do 2 chapters. I have one article, and I have the work on Paris about lay confraternities, but it didn't seem to fit. This was once again deciding to cut the material to fit the arc of the book. What is Catholic reform and who gets to decide? In each of the chapters, like the one about the Trinitarians, says from the perspective of my provincial Trinitarians, they were reformed. They were failing in some ways. It wasn't perfect. But what they were trying to do was a reform to make themselves a Counter-Reformation or Catholic Reformation order. What their abbot, I guess, what was his, I think they called it an abbot anyway, their superior in Paris said, is that you have not returned to the original rule. They've gone to one that was 50 years later. You haven't returned to the origins, and you're not giving the money, so you're not reformed. So each of the chapters is a debate about reforms. One of the chapters, one of the other things I found in the South was about the Dominicans and Sebastian Michaelis, and so one of the chapters is also a rereading of, he's most famous as a witch hunter, and I argue that he was a Catholic reformer who only accidentally became caught up in the witch hunter, and not a witch hunter who was accidentally also a Catholic reformer. There's a chapter on the Carmelites of Paris and Pontoise, arguing that there are 2 different versions of Teresa's reform. The Carmelites of Paris wanted to be the head of an order that would expand across France. They immediately enlarged the size of the convent and brought in lots of money and elite, and the Carmelites of Pontoise wanted to stay small and poor. And there you can see again the influence of my working in the Carmelite. I actually worked in the Carmelites of Paris. Had their convent destroyed at the time of the Revolution, and they had to move out after, in the 20th century, they moved out to the suburbs of Clamart and have now folded, actually. They no longer exist. But well, the Carmelites of Pontoise have refounded themselves by inviting nuns from Brazil. And so an interesting new blend that I think takes them in some ways back to their origins, because here they had Spanish nuns who didn't speak proper French. Now they have Brazilian nuns who speak Portuguese and are having to communicate only partially, and also it's very interesting. It's also very interesting to see that they've become they become more informal. When I sit in that little room working, as I did for this last chapter, I could look out the window and I could see nuns out in the courtyard and things in ways that I didn't before. Although they're still, it's not really it's really only the lay sisters that you see. They still are pretty close to their original rule, but there is a different atmosphere. Anyway, so that's that book that is coming out, and that led then also, as there may be a 5th book, but I don't know. That's just getting underway. The article that many of you that I suggested to Jim, that if people wanted to just read something, if you've not, the article on the sacred landscape of religious conflict and civic identity, battles over the sacred landscape of Montpellier, comes out of the newer work, which also then comes out of this question of the wars of religion, and how it lives on, not just in memory. There are other people working on memory. I'm interested in a legacy that's not even conscious memory as much as how it shaped religious relations, Protestant-Catholic relations in France and the generations afterwards. So if a book ever comes out of that, it will be about, the title that I'm using for a talk next summer for the British version of French history, the Society for the Study of French History, is Uncivil Wars, Legacies of the Religious Conflicts. And that's really where my work is going. I gave a paper last month in Montpellier that was for a conference on remembering the wars of religion. And I took on for that the project of reading 50 city histories that I could find online to see how these city histories remembered the wars of religion. And I was actually astounded to see how vindictive even early 18th century histories. Some of them by, they're done half and half, 50 it just came out accidentally even. Half were by lay authors, half were by clerics. I had 2 Protestant histories, all the rest were by Catholics. One of the Protestant histories is just the mirror image of the Catholic one. So there was the hard feelings were not on just one side. They're definitely shared on both sides. I wish I had more Protestant histories to use to look at, but the language of some of them, and if you're looking at the language of violence and the rhetoric of violence, it really was startling to me to see how persistent and how often, for example, that they simply are described as heretics, even in the 18th century. And at a point when it's 50 years after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, you really do have to ask yourself what's going on here. And I'm just at the beginning of that question because I am, of course, a historian of the 16th and 17th century. But the next book, if there is one, will go further. All right, I'm open to questions, comments, discussion.
All right, well, before we start questions, do what I should have done in the beginning, which is everybody go around and identify themselves. And we'll start with Bob Chrysler.
Bob Chrysler.
Tom Hannibal, sorry.
Do you want us to say anything more?
A word or two.
My claim to fame is I was his first teacher of French history.
I'm Tom Anderson. I'm interested in poor relief and charity, and in fact, I've just been working a little bit on the 16th century, so this all ears.
I'm Natalie Bennell. I'm a first-year PhD student working with Professor Collins.
Lee Stevens. I'm also a PhD student working with Professor Collins.
Nathan Michaelwitz. I'm a 5th-year PhD student working with Matt Colt.
Jacob Burnham. I'm a 3rd-year PhD student working with Dr. Collins.
My name is Hannah. I am a first year at the School of Politics.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last, your first year graduate student, what was the last thing?
School of Foreign Service.
Rebecca Andrews, first year PhD, working actually in New Spain, early modern Spain.
I'm Armin Manuk-Kloin. I'm also a first-year PhD, but I work on late Ottoman history.
Laura Goffman, 7th year PhD, Modern Middle East.
Elizabeth Cross, assistant professor here at Georgetown. I work on the 18th century French colonial empire.
I'm Ashley Corwin. I'm a 7th year PhD student studying under Professor Collins.
I'm Scott Cam. I'm also a PhD student of Collins. I'm a 5th year PhD student.
Well, I'm Jim Chanel. We know each other, and I have nothing to do with early modern France.
Henriette Rijntje, former student of Jim Collins, French wine and brandy trade with the Netherlands, and now at the National Gallery of Art.
I'm Adrian Boggins. I'm an archivist at the Woodstock Theological Library.
And I'm Mary Beth Corrigan, and I'm working with the Maryland Fountains Archives and Special Collections.
All right, let's open the floor to questions.
I spent the morning in the Dutch collections at the National Gallery, by the way.
Some of which have been.
I could have,
Curious.
if I were there, I could have helped you. I have a question. One of your comments in your sort of autobiographical article is that you consider yourself an outsider, or you mentioned that as a Protestant raised person, well, at least 10 years ago, you said it probably was helpful that I was an outsider looking in. Do you still consider yourself an outsider, or are you so knowledgeable that you're more of an insider than anybody else?
I think that would depend upon what, an insider to what groups. I mean, outside of some things, an insider to the small circle of French historians who work in this area, having worked there as long as I have, but an outsider for, still for religious groups.
Along the same lines, I wrote a book on the Convulsionnaire Saint-Médard, and I had to deal with, as a Jew, had to deal with Catholics, not just ordinary Catholics, but Catholics who had experienced miraculous cures and convulsions. I had to read in the anthropological and the medical and all kinds of literature. And one of the hardest things about working on that was to get mentally into the society and the experiences, and to do it in a way that was sympathetic, because most of the literature, what little existed, was extremely hostile. And I remember when I defended my thesis, one of the professors, this is at Chicago, the University of Chicago students had just had a sit-in, and I was very sympathetic to the students. And I felt that my approach to I dealt with ecclesiastical politics, and my approach was very much in treatment of issues of authority. And the examiner said, "You seem to be very anti-authoritarian," and of course that's always been true, and I'm pleased my children are as well. But it was so hard, and I just wonder how. I mean, Keith Baker, I was his first PhD student. This is not his area. How have you immersed yourself, I mean, just not whether inside or outsider, but just become empathic?
That's good. I'm glad you raised that. I actually, in my notes, were trying to figure out how I could cover my long career in a short time. I mentioned, but that I didn't get to, the influence of reading anthropology and reading widely in my field. I think for me, had Carolyn Bynum's book not come out earlier, writing about medieval nuns who were doing strange things with food, who were starving themselves, flagellating themselves and all, it would have been, I had a head start there that nobody had looked at it for Catholic Reformation era, but there was something there. Anthropology, I mean, I am not, I always ask questions, and I'm not strong on methodologies in the sense that some historians take a given methodology and kind of try to fill it in. I think there I benefited from Natalie Davis's suggestion that you read widely and then you borrow what you can, but don't get pinned down by methods. But yeah, I mean, reading in Barbacaris, the testimony for her beatification about the mysticism and the spells and things that she would fall into, it was very hard for me. But as I say, I did have, I think, a bit of a head start that you lacked, that some people had at least looked at it in other contexts by the time I started doing this. So I was able to kind of the suspension of disbelief and say, okay, at a certain point it doesn't matter if this is what they thought we need, this is how we deal with it. I'm not asking whether she really had intense union with God or not. The God part of it's not my question. The question is, this is the way she felt.
Yeah, just to follow, I'm embarrassed by my dissertation. I think it's a piece of crap. I am extremely proud of my book because in the decade or less than a decade between the time I wrote my dissertation and I wrote the book, among other things, Keith Thomas's Religion and the Decline of Magic came out. And so I became much more attuned to other methodological approaches and other ways of looking at these phenomena. And so those of you who are working on dissertations, don't despair if your dissertation turns out to be, well, if you have Jim Collins as your thesis, it will turn out crap. But I mean, just, you learn and you grow and you start asking new questions. And I mean, that's one of the things about being aware of being surrounded by other bright graduate students and good professors, is that they force you to ask questions that may not have occurred to you.
I would second that, and also the importance of using your sources widely. I mean, gather as much information as you can. Those of you that haven't yet gone to the archives, know what you're looking for. Don't just take mad photographs, because eventually you have to read those. And it helps to have sorted that out some before. I mean, when we went, it was pencils and paper. It took a long time to get past that, a long time before finally the archives in France, the archivists decided that we were, their fragile pieces of paper were better off if we weren't leaning on them and if we could just photograph them. But the temptation to go the other direction now is, I see people coming home and saying, oh, I've got 5,000 photographs. I said, fine, but you know, somewhere you need to find a dissertation in that. So don't get too carried away with the photographs. The other thing I would say, learn from my mistake, is I still keep good notes of what you're photographing at the time, because it's very easy to go back and wonder what is in this stuff, and if you don't, you know, if you basically have a summary of what you think it means, it's going to be a whole lot better going back to it than if you just keep. Because and I say this knowing how easy it is to just keep clicking on a day, and you know the clock is running out, the archive's going to close. If you don't go back that night and also write down what you were summarizing, what you were working on, you really are in trouble. So.
You just said something really interesting. You said you have 5,000 photos. You have to make sure that there's a dissertation in there somewhere, which assumes that you go to the archives without knowing what you want to find?
Well, no. It doesn't. It assumes you knew what you wanted to find and you got carried away by things that seemed related, but that you know you don't have time to go back to all this, and so it's related, but you're not quite sure how. You figure, well, I'll figure that out later, whether it's useful. And so my point is to keep going on the what you, yes, what the thesis, have your assumptions, your the idea of what you think you want to find. Keep an open mind, look at a wide variety of sources, but don't just keep clicking at the camera or
Thank you. I'm interested to hear more about your process and how it's changed over time across writing these books, from how you go to the archives, taking notes, because you mentioned several times how your sense of a narrative of a book ended up shaping decisions that you made. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how you move from archival work to note-taking to writing, how you organize your notes, how that's changed over time. Mm-hmm. as you've written more books.
Okay, it's a big question, and I think some of the change has been from the fact that, unlike the first book, which the dissertation had to get done and then it had to get turned under a certain schedule into a book, that I had to move more quickly, and basically the structure of that my first book is Paris City Councilors is the structure of my dissertation. Now, when I went to the archives, I was urged to think not just of a dissertation, but of a book. And so it didn't change as much as it might have, but I think that was all that I could have done with that anyway. I don't look back at that, and I don't look back at it often, actually. When I look back at it,
It's still really good stuff, I've been looking at it.
I'm not, no, I mean, you know, I think it was a good book. I just wouldn't do that, those questions again, or it would be a different way. I'm pleased with the fact that already there, I was interested in the literary dimensions of marriage and family, as well as what I found in the archives. That's been a constant of my work all the way through, has been, and that may have to do with the fact that I was, as an undergraduate, I spent my junior year in France, and by the time I came home, I had a French major kind of by default. I added the history major because I didn't want to teach French, and it wasn't, at that point, there wasn't much else to do with the French major. So, but at the time, I could put history, I could use literature and history, but it was a deconstructionist era in which the last thing they wanted to do was to put history into what the author thought he was saying, and it was always he as the authors in those days anyway. And it was 19th century literature, it was the literature of Zola and Balzac that I was interested in, and I could use that as a historian, but I couldn't do the other way, so that's partly how I became a historian. But anyway, that's been a constant through my work, has been to look at the literary side of things. The way that my work has changed has partly been availability of archival sources over time, so it's hard to sum up as I've talked about the different kinds of sources. I don't have, I mean, the narratives, after writing Paris City Councilors, I wanted to do some narrative history. That was partly also the choice I made for Beneath the Cross, was to try to explain why not the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The literature at that point was really, whether was it the king or the Queen Mother, who was responsible, who said to kill the Protestants. It wasn't why did the people of Paris kill their neighbors, and that was the fundamental question that kind of drove the narrative of that book. But if you look at the book, that's half the book is a narrative, and then the next chapters are these analytical chapters that I have described. And I wanted to, I wanted to write some narrative, but I found that wasn't enough. I couldn't integrate everything into the narrative. From Penitence to Charity took me a long time. I mean, Beneath the Cross came out in '91, From Penitence to Charity in 2004. I had the leisure to think about these things that, again, you don't have when you're writing a dissertation and first book. It took a long time for that one to mature into a book. From the Beneath the Cross somehow went quickly. I got, and I still needed that promotion, but it wasn't even the promotion. It was something, that book just wrote itself fast. The narrative came quickly. From Penitence to Charity didn't, but ultimately I liked writing narrative in the sense of I wanted the book to go from somewhere to somewhere, and I didn't for a long time see that it was a narrative, again, from Penitence to Charity. Planning the Cross is a different, because again I had these bits and pieces and I started looking at them. I actually proposed at one point, to just discussing with my husband, who's also a historian, maybe I should publish these just as essays. Thinking back, Natalie's got these wonderful essays, but also that there are other ways I could do it. And then he said, well, draw up a proposal. And when I drew up something, and he looked at it and said, send this to your editor at Oxford. I think she's going to like it. And she did encourage me to continue doing it. What I realized as I thought about it, I said I have these bits and pieces about Catholic reform, but I needed to put some further ones into it. As I haven't even mentioned, actually, that the decision to go to Languedoc was because I needed to get to a Protestant part of France. All of my work at that time. First, I've been working in Paris as a Catholic area, Provence, although there had been some Protestants there, but it was a very strongly Catholic area also. So I decided I needed to add a third part of France, and that's what the next book will do. I worked in archives actually in about 4 cities, in Toulouse, in Albi, in Montauban, and in Montpellier, before finding that the richest archives were in Montpellier. Again, I just kind of collected what I could with no deadline, no time frame. And it was there that what became the article about Montpellier was the realization, the richness, the archival find essentially there, what was in the H series there, were all of the lawsuits for the convents that had been destroyed, the convents and monasteries and churches that had been destroyed in the religious wars. And that's what gave me the clue, essentially, that what this was going to focus on was how people react when you destroy their churches, when you destroy things that are sacred to them. Instead of it being a St. Bartholomew's Day, one big explosive event, it took me to an understanding that the longue durée, as we would have said when we were doing it as social history, was important for the religious history. Also, that I kept finding people were still fighting over these properties in the 1640s. They'd been destroyed in the 1560s, and some of the records had also been destroyed. So seeing how these things, how central they were to people's understanding. But that just came out of the archives, and again, I can say I can do this because, well, we did the book for Overt, and I did some articles, but it's been a long, my book will come out in 2019, 15 years, from one book to the next. And so I guess my other point would be that sometimes these things just take time to see that a book is there.
I'm going to jump in there for 1 second, back to your question, Laura. Those who've sat in on my seminars know that Professor Diefendorf just touched on a point near and dear to my heart. And I'll just remind you that I'm not the only person who says this, that your dissertation should be conceptualized as a book. That there's a difference between your dissertation and the book that will be derived from it. That it is a lot easier to turn it into a book if you conceptualize it as a book from the start, rather than something simply an end in itself. Your dissertation is partly an end in itself if you want a degree, but it's a means to an end. And there is a difference about conceptualizing such things. And you make yourself, you're going to make your dissertation a better dissertation. You can make it a lot easier to turn it into a book in your 7th year. So it's kind of late in the day. I hope you did this already, but it is.
Better start over.
It's a little late to start over. Well, I do want to mention one other point, because I think it's something that we easily forget in the field. You may recall that Al Hampshire on Tuesday also talked about Al Sommer, right? When we were having our little conversation, and Al and I had a little conversation about how we first met Al, and talking about looking at the handwriting. Now here's a person that even those of you working on this field may not have read his stuff. There's not a lot of stuff by him out there. There are a few articles. We did talk about the sodomy article and the witchcraft articles. But you can see how someone like him, who has spent all of his life in Paris and has an exceptionally high level of skill and knowledge about something relatively small, so to speak, in the sense of restricted in time and space, can have an enormous influence on a field, because that person's knowledge may help me, Professor Diefendorf, Professor Hampshire last week, and lots of other people I've encountered Al Sommer over the years, both French and American. And so there are people like this in the field who don't write big monographs, who are not necessarily the best known people, but they often have a remarkable degree of skill and knowledge that we overlook at our peril. And I think Al is a great example of that.
Yeah, he is.
And a lot of our French colleagues have learned enormously from.
Yeah, that reminded me that something else I did want to bring up. I was too timid when I went off to do my dissertation research. Natalie Davis said I should look up Tony Richet, who actually fits into this category also. Written some very important articles, and then some general studies on French institutions and things that are extremely important, but not in his own field, but he was the expert on Paris, and he had a seminar at the École des Hautes Études that Natalie said I should go to. Well, the first part of the year I was busy trying to figure out who I was going to study before I ended up deciding on and learning to read the handwriting. That is one advantage today also, and being in Washington too, but there are good summer programs now to do paleography, which didn't exist. I remember Natalie showing us one day, pulling out a photocopy, a poor photocopy of a 16th century document and essentially showing us that it could be done. But that was it. That was my training in choreography before I went to France. So I had to teach myself, and I did, as most people do. You find a document that's published somewhere and you read the document. But anyway, I did not go to Richet's seminar. The first time I went back to Paris to start doing revisions, a young man came up to me and introduced himself as somebody who was working on the Paris, the quartiers, who were the officers of the port of the neighborhoods in Paris. And the archivist had told him that I was working on the city councilors, and he said we have some families in common, and invited me for coffee, and that turns out to be Robert de Simon, who's been a very important historian. And Robert dragged me to Denis Richet's seminar. Richet was became a wonderful mentor to me also, because he was the kind of person that can look around and say, you know, he'd see me sitting there quiet, but he could see the look in my eye that there was something going on in my head, and he would draw it out of me, which, considering that I was the only foreigner in the room and these were mostly his students, I would have otherwise just sat there mute had he not tugged on me to get me to participate. And one of the other students there was Denis Cruzet, and because I was starting at that point to be interested in religious violence, and Denis and Robert became friends, and they're still friends now 30-something years later, and it was just luck and coincidence that became two of the most prominent historians of their generation. But that can happen, and I strongly, recommend that you take the context. Professor Collins has lots of contacts in lots of places and can suggest to you, but take advantage of getting to know both your generation and then whatever the local universities are, who are the more senior people in your field, because it certainly changed my experiences in France as well as my way of doing history.
You can also see with the three of them the different ways of having it. So Robert's stuff has been overwhelmingly articles. Right, and the articles are amazing. I mean, there's so many articles that are really the best thing about fairly large topics, actually, topics that matter about. Astonishingly productive, whereas Cruzet has written one monstrous book, and then a whole bunch of other books. So he's really been much more focused on books.
Yeah. And
both of them have trained a lot of students.
Yeah.
In different types of things, and many of their students have done great things. Richet's probably this seminar, and then the little Pensée de la France moderne, which really sort of structured the way everybody thought about things. And actually, that's what I wanted to call the lectures at the Collège de France. I wanted to call that book Repensée la France moderne, and they wouldn't let me do that. But I thought it was very interesting. The only review I saw in France was a guy who wrote a review of it for Figaro, and he caught on right away that that's what I was going to do. Because he says, the subtitle of his review was Repensée la France moderne. And I thought, well, at least this came across clearly in the thing. But it shows you that someone like Richet also wrote a book with François Furet. They did a joint on the French Revolution in 1965, which was pretty radical for 1965, I think it's fair to say, and would set the agenda in a lot of ways for the research in coming years. Another guy like that was Jean Mauvais, the great economic historian, who had an enormous influence on all of the next generation, and his only book came out after he died. And so, there's not just one way to be a historian who has influence. All right, so that's Nathan.
I'm wondering about the timing of the birthing of your ideas for your new books. You made a comment about Planting of the Cross and how it was somewhat accidental, but the others, how they kind of work into one another is pretty clear from what you're talking about. But I wonder when that was happening. While you were writing Paris City Councilors, was the idea for Beneath the Cross really kind of blossoming from what you were reading there, and you had footnotes of I need to, this would be great for a second project when I get done with that, or was it generally a post facto series of decisions?
Mostly post facto, because I when you're trying to finish a book, doing so much to get it done. But it was as I was writing a chapter about the sons and the sons' careers when I had to confront the fact that the sons that were not following in the patterns that were most expected of them were Protestants. That started something turning in my head that became the question about why are they Protestants? I mean, it's I have to pose it as that kind of question because it seems like a silly question. You can never really know exactly why somebody, but why be a Protestant in Paris? What was the appeal of it? And then at the same time also writing the parts about the city councilors. Claude Marcel, as I was reading other literature, particularly one of my ultra-Catholics there, he was often accused of heading the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre because he was close to Catherine de' Medici. He was one of her counselors, and he had been parasitic. He had been the prévôt des marchands up until 2 weeks. That position turns over in early August, and it was just 2 weeks before the massacre. So people had assumed, since he was a known Catholic hothead, but as I was writing about him and his family and the marriages of his sons and his daughters, I had to deal with the question about, doesn't he have more at stake? Why would he want to riot in the city of Paris? Doesn't he have more at stake for his family and all of he's achieved in public order rather than violence? Now, that can't be proved one way or the other, and have now read enough about Catholic violence to know that it's possible that I don't think he did, but I mean that it's certainly possible that the Catholics justifying their violence, there certainly are ones that it was possible to do both. But at the time, the point that I took that led me to Beneath the Cross was that it made more sense that the high government of Paris, they had more of a stake in order than in violence. And that opened then, I guess, so again, these things come in the process. When I found these radicals, my arrest record showed me that a small number of men were doing most of the arrests, led gradually to the realization that it didn't have to come from the top, that you could have radicals within the city militia who were doing things that weren't necessarily ordered by their superiors. And that remains, I think, it's a controversial claim, but it's not been controverted. It's been pretty much the contribution, I would say, to the larger literature on St. Bartholomew's Day. If you look at something like Arlette Joanna's book, which is now considered kind of the standard work on it, she takes my argument and says, yeah, that's it. And that's also what these younger French historians now are Jeremy Froid, who has written about the making peace, to be familiar with his book. Jeremy is now working through some of these radicals that I looked at, and he's tracing them further and finding other things that they did and finding more evidence that supports it. So, but again, that's not something that I knew beforehand. It came out of then the collection of large masses of material, and the more you go over your material, you see something that you didn't see before that ultimately becomes an argument. Arguments grow out of evidence.
I think since you're Stephen Mack Holtz, it's kind of the reverse of Mack's question of the last 20 years, right? Where everybody just assumes that the default drive is you stay Catholic, and that it's not a choice. But of course, it is a choice. And there's virtually nothing about, well, why would you stay Catholic in, let's say, the 1560s? Right? And so if you think about his wine book that's just come out, or it's about to come out. Actually, it's out.
I just got a
copy.
copy.
Did you get your copy? I haven't got my copy yet. I don't know. I'm supposed to get 2 copies. I'm going to the editor. Right?
You don't have your name on the back cover.
That's true. No, I do have my name. It's in my series. It came.
It's in your series. No, but my blurb.
You're one of the blurbs, right? Okay. Well, I got the invoice, so I know it's on its way.
It arrived yesterday.
Oh, okay. Well, Mac had a copy when he was here. But, you know, that whole book of why did people stay Catholic? What was the obviously most Burgundians stayed Catholic. And it's an interesting question that people had simply not posed before. That whereas there is literature about why once you become a Protestant, right?
not in
not necessarily in Paris, where it was a
Yeah.
very dangerous thing to do. So, anyway. Lee,
I have a
is
question.
that over? Jake?
So your work, as you've mentioned, integrates literary and other published sources with your archival research. And I'm wondering to what extent you think that is possible or advisable to do in a dissertation, and do you have any advice on how to carry out those two types of research sort of at the same time, or any process advice on integrating those?
No, I mean, I guess, the advice still is to read widely, think widely, and hope for enlightenment. There aren't any magic formulas, but I don't recall. I was always working on both, and it depends a little bit on where you are. Life intrudes also. When I was doing these earlier projects, there were not books on, there was no Google Books, there was no, so I had to be able to get to the libraries and archives, and what I read at a given time was partly just by my circumstances, because I was either home and even getting over to Cambridge to work at the libraries at Harvard, from BU when you've got a full teaching schedule was one thing, but getting over to France was something else again. So my alternation there, while you're a student, well, when you can all the time in the archives spend doing that, and when you're back, use your time juggling between the things.
Jake, you have a question?
So a big theme of these presentations have been kind of practice and experience. And last Tuesday, when Dr. Hampshire was here, he remarked that Dr. Collins and
there's a father department, unbelievable.
that Dr. Collins often tells us to follow the money, and that Dr. Hampshire said to follow the marginalia. And I was wondering whether you had something along those lines of kind of when you get stuck in the archives and you don't know where to go next, or maybe what kind of drives your question, if you have a follow the something.
Follow the marginalia. It hasn't been either money or marginalia for me. Sometimes it's follow the footnotes, though. Definitely follow the footnotes. Again, I got to Madame Acari via the footnotes. I also got one of my other fun experiences in the archives. Not that all of it's fun, but special archives was the White Penitents of Montpellier. And they end up mostly in footnotes, but I discovered in a footnote that they still exist in the city of Montpellier. And I Googled White Penitents, and my gosh, they had a website, and they had a prior, and he answered my email. I mean, he answered it very promptly. And it happened, I was working there, I guess I was working there, I forget before which holiday, Corpus Christi Day or something like that, and he invited me to come and he would show me the archives, and he would bring out the archives that I'd seen footnoted while he was getting the chapel ready for the services they were going to have the next day. So in this musty little church inside the walls of the old city of Montpellier, I met this ardent white penitent, but who also explained to me things that aren't in the records, but showed me their records and gave me a real sense of what this organization. He makes it seem very moderate, which is hard to when you see their Ku Klux Klan outfits. It's kind of a suspension of disbelief all over again, right? And they actually have women in them too, which he says although they weren't recorded. But that fell into the background of the article on Montpellier. It's not, but shaped my argument in important ways, because that was where I could see the Catholic resurgence after after 1600, when it's still a Protestant-dominated city. The white penitents had very limited routes that they could do processions in the city. The Protestants basically controlled the city streets still and kept them. Most of their ceremonies had to be within the church. Once Louis XIII had retaken Montpellier for the Catholics, then immediately you could see their processions expanding through the city, new crosses being erected, new outposts, and basically you could see the civic landscape changing from it. So even though much of that ends up ultimately in footnotes, it was one of these formative archival experiences that shaped the way I understood the city. And so again, the things that you all are asking me, these are not predictable how things will fall into place. Why I keep emphasizing, keep the open mind, read as widely as you can, and hope for inspiration.
Ashley, as your hand up, and then
You mentioned early on in your talk about being one of the very few women in the profession when you first started. Can you speak a bit about if you've seen changes, or have things changed for women in the profession, have they not, and what it's been like to kind of go through the past 20, 30 years in the profession?
Well, I mean, there have been huge changes in that respect. I think I came at a lucky moment when the barriers were dropping. It would have been harder even a few years earlier. I have few stories of overt discrimination. One of my teachers, I was add in the terms of the personal. You know from Jim that I'm married to a historian, because I said that's how we met when my husband was teaching with him at Stanford. I met my husband in my first graduate class. He was going to take his orals that year. I was in my first class. He was doing 19th century Germany. I was doing 19th century France. But so it's been formative for me having him there all these years, even though our fields are just moved into the 20th century. But it was when I told one of my professors that I was going to get married, and he said, "Oh, that's too bad. You could have had a future in this field." And I also recall my only other really negative experience was that in the history department at Berkeley is on a huge square. I was the research assistant for Roger Hahn when he was finishing his first book on the Paris Academy of Sciences, and one of his ruder colleagues who had an office across the square, we were finishing up work one afternoon. I could telephone and I could hear his loud voice over the telephone and see him in the window. Made some rude comment that I don't exactly remember about how he was working with, his young female student. And Hahn just said, yes, and her boyfriend is waiting at the door to walk her home. But it embarrassed and infuriated me, because then my first thought, though, was not for me, but that is Roger Hahn going to ever have a female research assistant again? Is this what he has to put up with male colleagues? Is this the problem that we face as women? Because as a research assistant, I mean, I was doing the index for his book and doing things like that, and meeting often late and early. But I did not feel that I was discriminated against. There basically, when I started, there wasn't much fellowship aid. There were some national fellowships, and Jeff was lucky enough to get one when somebody else got drafted. But tuition was $100 a quarter, and I could work 2 days a week at the job that I had the year between undergraduate and graduate school, and I could afford to pay rent and stretch a pound of hamburger or a tuna salad or something, and I could live on it my first couple of years. But then I got the graduate fellowships to go do my dissertation research. I got the teaching assistantships. I did not feel discriminated against at that point. And then, but in jobs, it was also still a problem. When I got my job at Boston University in 1980, I was one of the graduate students at the University of New Hampshire, who's gone on to a very distinguished career and been actually president of the AHA. Laurel Ulrich was just finishing her dissertation, and she congratulated me on my job, and her dissertation director turned to her and said, "I thought this was your day. How come you're congratulating her?" Laurel said, well, she just got the job at Boston University. And her dissertation director turned to me and said, "A man needed that job." And I said, "Well, all 3 finalists were women." That's all I could say. But I know he had also said to Jeff, my husband, who was in his department at one point, you know, that I should be Jeff's research assistant. Jeff told him my German wasn't good enough. My salary wasn't good enough either, he did say. He said, you know, and I don't have your salary. But anyway, so but that's where I say I think I came at a turning point when it was possible to do things. I don't feel that I was ever turned down for a job. But I was the only woman on a lot of committees. I found myself being drafted for things early on. I had a president at Boston University who was notorious sexist, and women, there were stories in other departments, and I did feel when I was up for tenure and when I was up for promotion that I had to be better than the average tenure candidate. But I got tenure, I got promoted, so my career, it never really held me up, but I was conscious of being promoted. And mostly at the beginning also, the 70s are a time like now when it was very hard to get jobs. And an academic couple, we were very lucky that we got jobs within a commuting distance of one another. But I was certainly, as I was finishing, I had a lot of doubts about whether I should be, well, first of all, when I got my fellowship to go to France, my husband was teaching at Stanford then, and he encouraged me to go, even though at that point it meant leaving him for a year, and we've been married for 2 years, and so juggling your private life. Men are now also juggling, but at the time that I was doing it, it was just assumed that it was the woman who was doing the juggling, and that the man's career would come first. Had Jeff not encouraged me to take it, saying, well, you'll be disappointed in yourself if you don't do it, I probably would have dropped out at that point. At the end of the year, and actually, he was lucky that he got asked to teach at Stanford in Germany and Berlin. So spring semester he was in Berlin and I was in Paris, which was a lot closer, overnight train ride. But then he came to Paris for the summer, and when we were about to come home, and I sat there in tears saying, I don't have a dissertation, I need to stay. And he sat me down and talked me through things, and he said, your problem is that you have 4 dissertations and you haven't decided which one to write. And with that encouragement, and he promised me that if I came home, if in 6 months I knew which dissertation I was writing and I knew what I needed to go back for, that I could go back, even though we had not much money, and I had no job, I had nothing at that point. But that encouragement was also important, and it's not that everybody's personal life is going to come together with their work in different ways. I'm saying this only to say that we do have lives. We aren't just minds and scholars and historians, and we do have to kind of figure out how these are going to work together.
I went with Bob, who worked for many years for AAUP and could recite chapter and verse on some of the unpleasantries that happened to women in various universities around the United States. We won't go there, but if you want to ask him questions at the reception, you can find out all you really want to know or don't want to know, as the case may be. You had a question.
Yeah, in this talk, basically, you've been talking mostly about how your research trails have evolved from the literature you've been reading, or footnotes, or one step from the other. And as somebody who's beginning to look at, and both of us are looking at a collection of writings by people by really Jesuits who were counter-Reformation, they come out of the counter-Reformation, coming to the United States, and we have, sermons, treatises, poetry, all kinds of things, in addition to, their parish diaries, and and they're teaching slaves, and they're encountering Protestants in this country. And it seems to me, the collection has so far been described as looking really from the point of view of the nativists of the 19th century is that there's this anti-Catholic prejudice that they're fighting, and I see something much more aggressive in these papers, and it's something we don't understand. So my question to you is how have archivists helped you in reconceptualizing or thinking about the sources that you have? Have they helped you? And what opportunities exist for the two of us who really have to reach out and try to promote the use of these sources?
Yeah, it sounds like you've got fascinating materials. When I say I'm an accidental early modernist, I think I could have been an accidental almost anything else had I been nudged in a different direction and had different the fact that I started French in the 7th grade also kind of pushed me in the direction of doing French history, and if I have any regrets it's that I didn't, that my Latin isn't better, my German isn't better, and the other things that I could have used, but the materials that you have, I honestly have not, I can't cite any particular archivists except for perhaps the one that told Overt Discrimination who I was, that influenced me, but it wasn't the archivist herself. She didn't suggest any documents or anything else. I can't think of the archivist in the White Penitents or the archivist at the Carmelites. They opened their documents to me, but they didn't offer any.
Does it sound like you had passive?
Yeah, I mean they served me the documents I asked for. They didn't know them well enough themselves. Actually, the White Penitents prior knew the material, but he knew it in a different way. It wasn't anything he said or did or encouraged me to look at that helped. And it would be probably different. I mean, my friends who worked in provincial archives had different experiences, who did their work there first. Most of my work, my first years, was in Paris in the Bibliothèque Nationale and the archives there, where it's pretty pro forma unless you really seek out the archivist. They're not gonna help you more than you ask for. But so my experience wasn't that helpful. But I think it's great that you want to be. So encourage people to work on it. I think
we're mandated to actually.
Unfortunately, Tuesday we talked a lot about this sort of topic because our guest Tuesday, Al Hampshire, has spent time in over 20 provincial archives. I've been to about 25 departmental archives and 20 to 25 municipal archives. So we were having actually a discussion about, extensive discussion about provincial archives. And the one thing I would say about it is that, and you already mentioned this Series H and Series G, that most of our archives in France were classified in the 19th century and organized at that time. And we are prisoners of the decisions that they took. And sometimes that works out great, but other times the way they divided stuff, for instance, judicial archives of the Ancien Regime are very difficult to use because of the way that they were organized. And so they're classified where in one place you're going to have what's called a sac de procès, which is the supporting documentation. You're going to have the actual trial in a different place, and the sentences are still in a third place. So it's almost impossible to know what the final outcome of a given trial was. I mean, it's very, very hard to find that out, particularly if you're dealing with the Parliament of Paris or the Parliament of Brittany, where the archives, I mean, the archives of the Parliament of Brittany would easily fill a floor of the ICC, probably several floors. Paris, you know.
And unless you have an execution, you never really know it's the end.
Yeah, that's right. There's always an whatever. But and so when you all are classifying and organizing things, yes, you are setting agendas not only for historians today, but
actually, one of the things
setting patterns for decades to come.
One of the things that we're trying to wrestle with is the Maryland Province Archives had basically its fundamental arrangement has come over a period of 300 or 350 years, which is unusual for U.S. records, and the person who's probably most responsible for the way it's arranged was the treasurer of the archive of the province in the 1910s, you know, and he was trying to answer a lot of questions related to the property and the standing of the institution because they were trying to make decisions about what to do, and in many cases, that sort of counts for the arrangement of it, and it's kind of divorced from the structure of the institution. So one of the things we're hoping to do is to figure out a way of creating an intellectual rearrangement so that when we digitize it, we're presenting something that's online that restores the organizational sense, you know, that there was provincial and these were provincial letters. They're not even described that way. You know, we have a series of letters and it doesn't even look like, you don't even know who they're from. And then I look at them and go, oh my God, these guys are all provincials, you know, so it's trying to figure those things out so that there's at least a sense that you knew where this is coming from, instead of something that's been rearranged to, and there have been attempts to re-describe it, and it's just nothing has worked. So the burden is figuring out something that'll work, and that at least we don't have to do it again. That's really the
one advantage
thing.
in France is this was highly centralized in the 19th century. So virtually everybody, even today, has been trained in the same place, the École des Chartes. And so when you go from one provincial archive to the next in France, the documents of a given type are always in the same series, because that was mandated a couple of centuries ago. The other thing is that particularly in the late 16th century, the period we're talking about right here, a lot of those towns that you were talking about decided, partly because the royal government was trying to put this squeeze on them for more money, that they needed to get their own archives well organized. And so again and again in deliberations in this period, you're going to see that they actually were organizing and categorizing archives back in the 16th century, and they're paying an archivist. And this is redone episodically in the ensuing centuries. And so some of the stuff where things are divided today, like the financial papers, are in a given place, you can actually show that that was being done already as early as at least the 16th century, possibly even earlier.
I think one of the things that you can do that is most helpful, and this is also, I would say also for people doing their dissertation research, is figuring out why the archives are, why you get what you do. It's what they think they need. Very often it is financial things. That was one of the disappointments of the Age series at first, is so much of it has to do with bits of property, and even more so in the National Archives, what's left of what's collected there from the religious orders of the old regime, much of that has to do with funding of this and that, the properties that they were given and the income that they had. It turned out to be a benefit for me in Montpellier because they were fighting over them still, and I saw something there. In other places, I wasn't so interested in that. I wanted to get beyond that to something else. But I think now for the National Archives, the archivists there have done very good guidance of the explaining each of the archival series, how it got to be there, what were the guiding principles at the time. And so reading the archives with an awareness of what their priorities were at a time, and to the extent that you can help your users by giving them that kind of history of their of the documents, I think is probably one of the most important things you can.
Yeah, you can see the contrast. In the 19th century, you see these summary inventories, inventaires sommaires, which are very idiosyncratic, perhaps we could say. Whereas in the third quarter of the 20th century, you get these guides des archives, which were done for the Archives Nationales and then for the departmental archives, that are organized in a way that makes it a lot easier. So Elizabeth, you had your hand up about something.
Yeah. So as somebody who's a couple of centuries removed from a lot of these discussions, I was just curious to know. In your remarks, you referenced some work that's being done by young French scholars currently in the field. And I was wondering what kinds of new themes, new ideas do you find the most exciting in your field right now?
Not just French scholars. This conference that I went to in Montpellier in September was interesting because it gave me a chance to meet the three people that organized it. One is French, one is Dutch, and one is British. The money came from the Netherlands because somebody had a good fellowship there. The location was chosen because the person at the Protestant Institute in Montpellier could offer a place, and the the Brit just contributed his ideas, I guess. He's also going to be editing some of the co-editing the papers that come out of it. But it was interesting, they deliberately, because they are, two of them anyway, are recent graduate students themselves. One is just, they both just published their first books, in fact, that they brought in graduate students. They deliberately sought to get French graduate students, to get at people at all stages of their career, and it was interesting. There were 16 of us, I guess, in all to be seeing. Some of the work by the French students is just narrow, that you can still see the traditions there of, you know, the dissertation director says, do this, and they're quite narrow. Others are reopening some of the old questions about what things mean. I was surprised that really good paper on St. Bartholomew's Day in Lyon. That it turns out, and it's the recognition that what happened in different places is not the same thing. You know, we've biased the story towards Paris, and there are a lot of parts of the wars of religion where still local studies of coexistence in Normandy, for example, will show things probably quite different from what I've seen in Montpellier. So I think the exciting work is things that at the moment that are taking into account what we know, but also pushing further on a lot of the themes. I think, I mean, more broadly, I think it's fantastic that so many of you are doing things that are international and that are, but that's not what my work is. So when you ask me, you know, I can say I think that history is going broadly in really exciting and interesting directions. My work is not going to go there because those aren't my questions, but I sort of wish they were. If I were 40 years younger, they might be, but.
Can I follow up per question before we get to Simone? Because that two of the literature, so you're talking about French scholars and young French scholars, young American scholars, and a lot of your stuff is touching on the Anglophone scholarship focused on history of emotions, and then, the role of emotions in religious feeling, whereas in France it's less the history of emotions and more the sort of écrit du fort privé.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people looking at very similar types of sources, but I've seen those two literatures sort of talking past each other. I mean, your work is much more focused on that than mine. How do you see those coming together?
I think you're right that they don't necessarily come together, that I have my own hesitations about both of them. Again, because my sense is that if we shouldn't be narrowing ourselves in ways like that. I still think that approaching something not just, you can't just narrow religion down to emotions. You can ask questions about emotions, including, I think Jenny Reinberg did wonderful her studies about just the Mass going back. And Virginia Reinberg, you've probably read, if you haven't read her book, that at least her really important article about what the experience of the Mass was. And nobody had ever tried at that point to say, what was it like to sit in a church and hear Mass? There were just generalizations about, the priest or the Assumption. We had some rather silly literature about the people not knowing anything about their religion, and all that mattered was that you come in and it was a priest's religion. And Jenny asking, what was religion like? I think showing that it mattered to people that there was an emotion felt when the Eucharist was held up and bells rang and things, that this was a highly emotional moment, and people had some idea of what was going on, even if they weren't learned in theology. So I think it's important to bring emotions in. Had she just written an article about the emotions of the Mass, I'm not sure she would have gotten as rich. And the fort privé, I don't know, I mean, I see that as kind of a mixed bag of literature that it ends up being too idiosyncratic. It's this person's fort privé, it's this, it's hard to generalize from.
Yeah, I had a follow-up on the archival question and sources. At the National Gallery I do quite a bit of research over centuries, tracking where paintings have been in their history, and it can be in France, in Germany, in Russia, in the Netherlands. So the best archives or the best sources are those that allow me to have one word and stick it in Google, and out come a huge range of hits. But that allows me to survey what is there, rather than our own search engine inside the National Gallery's holdings. I not only have to say the word, but I have to say in which field does this word fit. And if you mismatch that field, even though I know that the thing is there, I can't find it in the apparatus. So this is basically a plea for no matter how you organize or arrange an archive, given the fact that a lot of research is now started, at least digitally or in cyberspace, to make it as accessible and open as possible. And people will find you.
Tom, you've been dying to ask a question.
Oh, yeah, I have been dying. Well, it started from before we started here. I was, it's about, what I'm interested in is religion and charity, and we were talking before about, I found your article on 16th century Paris and its municipal Grand Bureau des Pauvres, very useful. And my question really is about how much difference there really is between Catholic and Protestant, and I'm sort of leaning to thinking there's more commonality than you would really think, or maybe charity is an area where there's more commonality. An example in Germany is the study of Augsburg orphanages, where there was Catholic and Protestant, and they're really the same except a little difference in finance, you know. But, and then also in terms of ideology, the fact that, you know, salvation by faith alone doesn't mean the charity is gone, quite the contrary. So there's charity, and it seems to me sometimes it's Erasmus and Vives is sort of everywhere still, even after there's a great division and different practices, certainly. What do you think there really, are there real differences and real commonalities?
I think I see more commonalities also. I see a gradual shift, although to, see if I can find the right word for either one, either Protestants or Catholics, for both of them, from being selective by choice to being inclusive by necessity, to going back to being discriminating by necessity. that there starts to be a sense that anyone who is poor is Christ-like, and we should be helping them. And then there gets to be this sense of who's the deserving poor, but that reaches its limits at the time, and that's part of what I write about in Paris also, is that what they keep doing is adding new forms without doing away with the old ones, because there is a need to care for just these masses of people who are showing up in the city because of the wars of religion and all. They have to do something. They don't like them, they may try to kick them out, but that ends up being a discrimination, but is a different kind of discrimination from an original sense that we can sort out the deserving poor, and they're still really, I think both Protestants and Catholics feel that the deserving poor are our poor. They are the ones who have been domiciled here, that we know, who are familiar to us. They are the ones who are poor by some kind of calamity, by accident, by illness or something. But then there is a realization that those aren't the only poor, that you have to do something about the others too. So, but I don't see Protestants and Catholics. I mean, mostly I've been working on the Catholic cities for this, but they seem to me, from what I know about Protestant cities in and outside of France, that is, I see a similar kind of thing going on.
Yeah, there's a typical distinction between vagabond and mendiant. Mendiant are people from your parish, your town, whatever. Vagabond or something different. And you see the regulations about them are different. Tax rules invariably have people who are described as mendiant or mendiante, typically women than men, and they have full rights to tax payers. And for instance, they have gleanage rights in the villages. As far back as I've seen tax rules that tell you what a person is, there are always quite a few people who are described as beggars, and there are people who are, as you're saying, Barbara, domiciled in a place. They're not somebody who just wandered in. There's some really interesting stuff in the local records at the end of the 16th century, local officials proposing absolutely draconian legislation about this. Rules where the town government is going to send somebody to everybody's house every 6 months to find out what you're doing for a living. I mean, just absolutely, you know, talk about Foucaultian governmentality, you know, and it's not coming top down, it's coming from the local people on the way up.
Yeah, I wrote about that for X and it's something that got published elsewhere. It's one of the things I was thinking about including and then really didn't belong in this book. And they set out for these visits, these domicile visits that were supposed to be, I think, every week or 2 weeks or something. And you look at the number of people on the committee and the number of people that they claim to be serving, it's not possible.
Right.
There's absolutely no way that they could have made these visits. So the gap between the legislation and the practice was huge there, and I'm sure it is everywhere, really.
And they often, their wives of these officials are often actually the ones doing their visiting. In Nantes, we have pretty good records of that, where the wives of the officials are the ones who are handling poor visiting people's houses. And it's interesting, an older married woman invariably takes a younger woman, not quite married yet, early 20s, with her to teach her how to do this. Right? And there's actually pretty extensive documentation. I have not seen that elsewhere. It's the only place where
I've not seen that explicitly. I have seen the committees, the deliberate overlapping of the committees, but not with a sense if it's an older, but certainly more experienced and the newer ones. And usually there was a gendered kind of division. In Paris, for example, most of the Dames de la Charité dealt with only the domicile poor. They were really the poor that were flocking into the Faubourg Saint-Germain, for example, mostly the men would deal with. But then there was the parish of Saint-André-des-Arts, where the women dealt with what was in the city walls and the men in the part of the parish that was outside of the city walls. Now that still may have been a sense that it was more dangerous out there, that was the really poor area, and so it was one of the things that I found, I think, that actually was new about the Dames de la Charité, was realizing, and it was one of the frustrations for Vincent, was that each parish insisted on organizing it its own way. They wouldn't accept the idea that there would be a common rule for it. They had their own.
Rebecca, last question. And we'll go have wine
pressure.
and cheese, and you can ask all the questions you want.
Well, I've been thinking a while about how to frame this question, because it's actually stemming from an observation I actually did. I went back to Beneath the Cross. I hadn't really read anything much earlier than some of the articles. And from the first, you talk about knowing, you have a sentence that says, I knew Claude Marcel well. And you sort of talk about him as a character that you had a personal relationship with. And then you bring the reader through into the city, and you seem to have a really personal relationship with Paris from that period. And so there's this sense of you've built your own conception of who these people are and that you know them. And I guess I'm thinking that maybe I'll frame this question and bring it back to writing and any advice you might have for people coming back from the archive. We've already spoken a little bit about stumbling upon things and bringing it in. How do you bring those personal relationships from the archive into your writing? And do you have any?
Well, if you look back at my first book, you will see that Claude Marcel is much less personal.
Okay.
This is the second book. In that first book, I'm dealing with him, and more explicitly, this is what I found out about him, and he's accused of doing this, and he's said to have done that. It was when I came to this book that I was able to kind of say, well, I knew him well, but it was with a kind of I don't think footnoted reference back to my earlier work. So I guess I would say don't try that in your dissertation. So.
Well, you do get a sense, though. I mean, when particularly people, for example, if you've read a lot of letters, like you probably have some sense of Catherine by now, having read a lot of her letters.
I think so.
Right? And having read her letters, Henri Catherine, you start to form a perception of these people, particularly when you have a case like that where you have a number. I mean, Henry IV's published letters are not only official ones, but letters to his mistresses. right? Where he's much more unfiltered, shall we say, right? And you develop a sense of what this person might have been like. And back to the Protestants and Catholics. I mean, Henry, on Bartholomew's Day, had a knife held to his throat and said, "Wouldn't you like to be a Catholic?" And yeah, okay, I'm a Catholic. You read his letters, he has a very different attitude towards religious toleration than, say, Louis XIII or Louis XIV. I mean, to him, this is a personal matter. And some of his letters about the Moriscos, for example, where he's writing to officials in Navarre, are absolutely amazing. He's talking about how this is an outrage, that they're persecuting people for their private religious beliefs, Muslims, right? But it mattered to him. You know, it mattered to him, I think, because of the experience that he and Condé went through with the king in the room and everything. That's very different experience than other people, and I think that matters. I mean, you know, you can talk about that. That's fair.
Yeah, I don't mean to.
Yeah,
I don't mean
but-
to discourage. I just mean that in,
Yeah, I know.
in this case, the particular.
All right, okay. So come on, we'll let you have one last thing.
I want to ask a question about our today's seminar's topic is religion. So you are I'm curious about your academic trajectory compared to your mentor is Natalie Davis. Natalie Davis is now she first she started religious things or the Protestant thing, something like that. But she moved beyond the early modern period and religious thing, right? So, but I'm curious about what makes you to keep the interest of the religion in the early modern times is holding that.
I don't know. There are a lot of different ways that people talk about historians as being foxes or hedgehogs, and I seem to be a hedgehog who keeps turning over the same dirt.
and then you said that you became accidental early modernist.
Yeah. I think that all I can say is that I keep, after each book, I still have enough questions that it leads to the next one. Instead of saying, okay, I've done that, and let's start something else entirely. And this, you know, I mean, I'm married to somebody who worked on the 19th century Germany and worked then on post-war Germany, and now has written about Boston and New Orleans and things also because he's moved from cities in catastrophe to cities wartime catastrophe to cities and other things, and so his work has been more the fox. And you know, and again, this isn't exactly what that is meant by that parallel, but yeah, I just keep finding the things that extend. There are new questions coming out of it, and I don't recommend it. That's just my own trajectory from that. I have benefited. I will say I benefited when my next two books about Paris, the fact that I had done the Paris City Councilors gave me a body, a knowledge of the city, that I was able to know people like Claude Marcel, and even Barbac Ali was actually the granddaughter of several of my city councilors, and so I knew where she fit socially. She fit on the social scale. When I was looking at nuns that were joining the convents of Paris, I also knew where they fit on the social scale. So things built. It wasn't consciously saying I need to use this. It was the questions came out of that, and then I was able to profit until a certain day came when I said enough of Paris. Time to go someplace else.
Speaking of time to go someplace else.